Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Booker's Place. Booker's Place is, in a sense, a documentary about a documentary, a story about a story. In this case, the story of Booker Wright, a waiter in Greenwood, Mississippi, who participated in an NBC documentary back in the 1960s, where he spoke about his experiences as a black man living in the South under Jim Crow. Having had the perceived audacity to speak openly about his experiences, angered locals, which resulted in Booker being harassed and ultimately murdered. While the story focuses on Booker Wright, there are also short interviews with the people who knew him. What's telling is that many of them, now decades later, express having also experienced some of the violence, harassment, and ill treatment that Booker endured. Booker Wright was a waiter who worked in a white establishment. At the time, this would have been under Jim Crow. So this particular restaurant would have been patronized by only white customers. And in addition to that, Booker was able to use that position to establish his own place, an eatery on the black side of town. But none of that on the surface sounds as though it should be problematic. But what brought about some drama is that within this NBC documentary, Booker spoke openly about, or rather gave a real and honest account of his experience living within this society, living within the Jim Crow South, the prejudice that he had to deal with, the internal pain that it caused him, and as such, residents of the community frowned upon this, and ultimately it contributed towards a lot of difficulties in his life, and ultimately, or arguably, his death, his murder. Frank DiFellino was a filmmaker who journeyed to Mississippi in the 1960s from New York to create a documentary for NBC. The plan for the documentary was to provide a realistic perspective on race relations in the South. Now, this was, like during the turmoil of the 1960s, where you had changing of the times, where discrimination against black people, racist behavior and whatnot, open hostility had been in existence in the South, arguably throughout the entire country, combined with obvious efforts to subjugate black people in the South, subject black people to being treated as second-class citizens, which one could argue also existed elsewhere throughout the country. But given the South's history with slavery, and then in the years thereafter with black codes, Jim Crow laws, this system really intended to establish as much as possible, maintain a new version of slavery in the years after the Civil War. When race and racism are discussed in America, quite often one of the first places that we look to is the South. Part of it is America as a whole, meaning both the South, the North, the West. The West to a lesser degree because that part of the country filled out a bit later, where America, its current position as a world leader, much of its economic success, its society, its social norms, were built on slavery or heavily influenced by slavery. As a result of that, because of the system of slavery, this very strict social hierarchy, social system with regards to clearly delineating between black and white, the enslaver and enslaved, you pretty much had at that time slavery, almost a simultaneous development of this racial system. Civil War ends, we now move to the late 1800s, early 1900s, with the establishment of black codes, Jim Crow laws. You then had amendments to the Constitution around the same time, where you couldn't just outright enslave black people anymore, but instead there now needs to be a workaround, the language that had previously been used to enslave black people. So you have the establishment of black codes, Jim Crow laws, all of these other systems intended to pretty much force black people back into a state of bondage. But given the amendments, it can't be blatant. It can't be so in your face. And so you have the development, for lack of a better term, a PR campaign of sorts, or a branding initiative to paint the system, which isn't that far removed from what it was under slavery. You then have this false narrative portraying black people as being loved and well-respected, well-treated in the South. There was just merely a separation between the two races because it was wanted by both races, but that black people were happy and content with their lot in life. And they were well treated in the South. They were considered a part of the family, a part of Southern society, never mind their position as second-class citizens. And so because you had such a large swath of the population playing different roles and trying to maintain this system to overcome black people, possibly pushing for progress and advancement, you would have either the threat of violence or violence itself to force black people back down, right? To back off these efforts of trying to achieve more. At the same time, you had this more subtle movement aimed at kind of whitewashing the reality of what black people were enduring in the South, where they tried to present it as black people were loved and well treated in the South and they were happy there. And the separation of races was something wanted by both, right? The lack of opportunities and all of these things were really for the benefit of black people. But with these two factors and factions trying to coexist at the same time, you would sometimes have it where the violence, the economic constraints, the otherwise oppressive and, the subjugate, things would push through, right? Make their way into the media and public knowledge. And in such instances, because it threatened this way of life, you would then have efforts to push these things back into the shadows, to not have them be public knowledge, where it might then lead to questions, or it might result in the South looking bad, in the government looking bad. You had not only black people being subjugated by the justice system, by extrajudicial lynchings, this terror, this kind of, there was this push as well for black people to not speak about their existence, to go along with this lie, to co-sign that everything was okay in the South. And Frank went into the South and started asking questions, and he was initially met with silence. So it's explained that he made more than one trip into the South. During the first trip, it sounds like it was just him, and at most maybe a handful of other people, but it might have just been him. When he went into Southern communities trying to ask questions to gauge what was the reality of race relations in the South, he was mostly just met with stone silence. No one would speak to him. In part because they didn't believe that he was who he said he was, and then possibly because they were trying to keep things that were going on in the South under wraps. And so with that, it's explained that he went back to New York and decided that he needed some sort of proof of his legitimacy beyond just like his press badge. He needed a larger crew, a larger production, so that people would take him seriously, that they would recognize that this is a real deal production. This isn't just some, random individual down here bumming around asking questions. And so when he returned to the South, he went back with like a full crew, an NBC van, to lend some legitimacy to this project that he was undertaking. And it's at that point that some people began to talk. The people that were talking would be like, your politicians, your public folks who would come out and they would offer commentary as far as the thoughts and feelings of the community. So there's like a few segregationists that are not necessarily interviewed, but like there's clips of them speaking. There's like this one conservative lady, but she was like the first one to sort of put out this idea of black people in the South being well treated and them loving being in the South. It's like this story that originated during slavery and kind of picked up steam in the years after. Never mind black people having been enslaved and not having control over themselves and their personhood, their families and whatnot, that they were supposedly happy living under these circumstances. After the end of the Civil War, you have that, once again, black people are being subjugated. And you have these spokespeople coming out, attempting to speak on their behalf, which is an issue in and of itself, trying to downplay the injustice that black people are having to deal with, right? Downplaying the ill treatment. There's like this fantasy about them being so happy in this subjugated position, in this oppressed position. Frank is around and he speaks to a few people. And pretty much the story that he gets from those who are willing to talk to him, where they speak about social racism, right? And structural racism. They try to excuse it away, presenting it as being beneficial to black people, but wanting to get beyond that, hoping to get a more realistic view, he ventured further out. And someone told him about this guy in this restaurant, and he ended up meeting Booker Wright, this black man who was a waiter at a local white restaurant. The restaurant, as it's described, was seemingly like pretty well-to-do for its time, kind of fancy. It sounds like it might have been a nice establishment, different steaks, seafood, whatever else. Like the place to go in town. But with this being the Jim Crow South, black people wouldn't have been allowed into the restaurant as patrons. So it's actually explained within the movie that one of the things that was very notable about this particular restaurant and is that the waiters, when they would come around to the tables, There were no written menus. So patrons of the restaurant wouldn't be given a menu when they came in, right? You couldn't just look through and see what you wanted and place your order. Instead, the waiters would come over and they would explain to you what was available. There were no prices or anything like that. You kind of find out how much whatever you order cost when you went to pay at the register after. And it's explained that part of this was that theoretically, if you walked into the restaurant as, let's say, a black person, there are no prices or anything like that posted. And so when it's time to pay for your meal, they can pretty much just tell you whatever. You know, you wouldn't be able to argue to the contrary. And so you have these waiters within the restaurant who are like, they kind of became an attraction. It was a thing for people to go and experience this thing of them, like just reading off this menu from memory, because the hospitality, the handling of the menu situation was so unique. And one of the men that was very like well respected for his ability to like just list off the items on the menu was Booker. Booker was a man who lived in Greenwood. He was the father of 3 children, married. He started working at the restaurant, and from there he received the opportunity to open a business of his own, right? Because never mind being a waiter, it was one of the better paying options for black people in the area. You know, given the reality of Jim Crow and these other systems that had been set up to, number one, limit educational attainment for black people, it resulted in them then having limited options for careers. And so you had very few job options. The vast majority of people living nearby, black people living nearby, were sharecroppers. And because of the system being set up in such a way where it was rigged for you to be taken advantage of and to not really make any money, it wasn't like a lucrative field for black people to go into. And so with that, he accepted this job as a waiter, which then allowed him to earn more money and through that to provide his children with a better education that he'd received, hoping that they would go on to have better lives. You know, Frank speaks to different people, but then he gets to Booker. And speaking to Booker, Booker really went into detail about the realities of working within this job as a waiter, the ill treatment that he suffers at the hands of patrons. It sounds like the owners of the restaurant might have been pretty okay towards him. You know, there's no real detail about that, but the customers at the restaurant, where it might be like local residents or them visiting with guests, visitors from out of town, this guy's name is Booker. And he goes into an explanation where people would come in, and there's like this often repeated thing that you hear from during those times where grown men, grown woman, grown black man, grown black woman would be referred to as boy or gal or something along those lines. You know, I'm not one of these people who buys into this thing of like hierarchy based on age, where old people are allowed to be rude or disrespectful to younger people or vice versa. You know, where just due to you being older, it gives you carte blanche to treat people however. You know, if you're referring to a grown man or a grown woman as a child, it's intended to be disrespectful. You know, referring to a female over the age of 18 or referring to a male over the age of 18 as boy or girl is disrespectful. And so he explains you would have some customers who'd come into the restaurant, and not that they'd necessarily call him boy, or they might call him boy, you know, but they might also call him like Bruce or Bob or whatever. They might also call him the N-word. You know, his name is Booker. And he explains that you would have some that would call him Booker. They would mispronounce his name. They might just randomly call him Jim, James, or some other random name like that. And it's like, if you think of like the Pullman car porters, right, which were mostly black men who worked on these railroad cars, where they would be referred to as George. And like, think about it, where within this context, he explains that they would come in, some of them would just call him some random name. You know, just use like a placeholder name for black people, for black men. But then you'd have others who would take it even a step further, and they would just refer to him as the N-word. And they would just refer to him as the N-word, or they would refer to him as boy. And so with that, you know, knowing that his name was Booker, you'd have some who would come in and they would ask him his name. They would say, you know, introduce themselves, ask his name. They would then call him Booker. But then as part of this reading off of the menu, just throughout the entire interaction of waiting upon people, the way that they would treat him, where it might vary, but within that, at one end of the spectrum, you had people who treated him as a human being and were kind and courteous towards him. But then the other end of the spectrum, the rest of the spectrum would be, people where they might be a little bit disrespectful or more neutral. But then it's like at the other end of the spectrum, you would have people who were like just outright disrespectful and rude to him. They would speak to him in this belittling and condescending kind of way. And he speaks to it where at face value, you might recognize the people who refer to him as Booker, right? Ask him his name and then call him Booker. So, they might be good people in the situation, but not necessarily. As he explains that even those who weren't rude towards him, that they might call him the N-word or, give him a hard time or whatnot. Patrons would speak to him in this belittling and condescending way. And you might have some who would refer to him as Booker. They'd ask him his name. They'd call him Booker. So, they might be like the good people in the situation. But he explained that even though you might have people that come in and they're rude towards him, they call him the N-word or this or that, whatever. And the nice ones, they would turn around and correct their white friends, the other patrons, are like, his name is Booker or whatever it is, or he's a good N-word or something, where they wouldn't be defending him because he's a human being with feelings. It's more like, don't mistreat Booker. He's my N-word, or he's a good N-word. So even with some of them being supposedly nice or coming across as attempting to be nice, it would still be tinged by and influenced by their racism. And so he went on from there to speak about how this made him feel on the inside as a person. He was speaking to his personal experience. It's a sense and feeling that you could then extrapolate to other people. This thing of this patronizing, condescending treatment that you have to put up with. And given the rules of society at the time, speaking up or speaking out against it, even just simply to say, I don't like the way you speak to me, or I don't like the way you treat me, you can find yourself in pretty deep problems for something, for something benign like that or obvious like that. And so often people would just have to swallow and internalize that pain, because to express any kind of displeasure with the way you're being treated could potentially put your life, the life of your family members, in danger. But what occurred is that in speaking out like this, Booker took a risk with his life. But this is really after a lifetime of having to put up with variations of this type of treatment. So it's like they go back to his childhood, him being separated from his mother, being raised to think that his mom basically abandoned him, threw him away, only to find out years later that his mother, when he was a child, was working for a white family. Back to this thing of limited career options. And in working for the family, they decided to move away. They took her with them, but she wasn't immediately able to take Booker. It sounds like, as they explained, that, when we first arrive, you're going to have too many responsibilities to also manage taking your child. So leave him behind until you get settled in. And this was basically a plantation where they were living. And when she returned to get Booker, the plantation owner refused to give her her son, basically coming up with the idea that she'd have to buy her child from this person, refusing to give her back her child. And then given the location, she had no legal recourse or anything like that. So basically she had to leave Booker where he was. And it resulted with him growing up with this very skewed idea, feeling unwanted, feeling as though his mother pretty much abandoned him, left him because she chose to, rather than the reality of her having been forced into that situation. And it's something that he didn't learn the full story of until years later. He was able to hire, it sounds like, a private investigator to seek out his mom. And that's when he learned the true story. And the documentary even went a little bit broader beyond Booker, where they spoke with, it's a little unclear to me, I think it's like his family members, or at least other members of the community. And then there's this older white man who was speaking about how well black people are treated in the South. And so with that, he takes the film crew on a tour of the sharecropper cabins on his property. Now imagine this. You have a job, you work, and as part of your job, part of your payment is housing. Your boss is leading a documentary, right, crew across the property and comes to your house, which should be your haven, a place of privacy and whatnot. He shows up with this film crew and asks you to step outside so he can take them on a tour of your house. They come in, they go walking around and whatnot, and he's explaining to the film crew the difference between the homes of, the difference between the homes or the resources made available to the good black people versus the bad black people. And the reality is, when he goes into these homes, one would imagine that it's like quite nice, as he seems to be rather successful. But his home, you would expect to be nice because he's rather successful. But he goes down to the home of these sharecroppers, and it's like, one is like reasonably maintained, but this is the 1960s at this point, and they still don't have indoor plumbing. It sounds like they don't have electricity. In its current state, it's missing a lot of, at the time, what would be common resources and facilities within a home. But with them being missing, he tries to clean things up. It's like, well, these are things we're working on. These are things that we're going to get. So it's like, like if they continue doing well, we'll get them some indoor plumbing. We'll get them some electricity, and that's for like his good black employees. Yet his good black employees don't have these basic resources. So it's like, we have plans to get them indoor plumbing. We have plans to get them electricity. Him kind of dangling this carrot, this supposed thing of like the reward for them being good black people in his eyes, being good workers, is he'll give them these things. But even yet still, when you listen, it sounds like the worker who likely isn't making much money as a sharecropper. As it's explained, and I've heard elsewhere, sharecroppers quite often, by the time they settled up with the landowner, if they received any kind of cash at the end, that was a benefit, because more often than not, it would somehow work out where they owed money. And they would never really be able to get out of this debt because they would just constantly owe money through the machinations of the landowner. But here it is that you have this guy who seems to maybe not like the indoor plumbing, electricity, and stuff like that, those future plans. But it sounds like from the little money that he has, he's probably hoping to fix up this shack that he's living in. This is the worker. The landowner then moves down the way to show them an example of the home of a bad black person, a black person that, doesn't do what he thinks they should do. And when you go into the house, you can see it's like pretty much the same footprint, but there's a drastic difference in the maintenance of these two houses. The second house pretty much looks like it's falling apart. It's a shack. Neither house is particularly impressive, but the second house especially looks like a shack. And he expresses that this is a result of the woman of the house, her husband not helping out. And it's like, you watch this kind of stuff. It's like a variation of this thing of when a white person gets caught saying something racist or doing something racist or prejudice, and then they trot out this, but I have a black friend. I've got one black friend. Or, I've had a black person over at my house. And so you have this landowner guy where he trots out this sharecropper as like, I can't possibly be racist. Look at how I treat these black people who live on my property in these shacks. And so it's interesting. It's heartbreaking, really, to see the reality versus the spin. And so then with Booker, where, he's had these experiences and seems to just be tired of it. He bites up the nerve and just speaks honestly about his experience, about the things him and other black people in the South within this particular area have to put up with. And unfortunately, as a result of that, because the story goes back to New York, it's edited, it's released on NBC as a documentary, it's like bedlam ensues. And it results in his business being burnt down, him being attacked by a police officer, him losing this job that he had, which, never mind him having been a waiter, it was like one of the better options in the area, or one of the best paying. And so it's like he ends up losing that job, but yet still he continues to persevere, even going so far as to become a bus driver for the Head Start program. This thing of him with his own children, where he states that while working as a waiter, He puts up with this ill treatment from patrons because he's focused on the long-term game, that this job won't be killing him on the inside. It might be killing him on the inside, but it's providing him with the opportunity to give his children an education that he could not have, that he could not obtain. And his hope is that while he might be dealing with hardships in life and he might be suffering through this, that he's making this sacrifice in hopes that it will provide his children with better opportunities where they won't have to go through these things that he's going through. And as part of that, the importance that he placed on education. When he lost his job, he then became a bus driver because he saw it as being necessary for getting young Black children from the area to school. And that was his way of being active and helping, right? Which I think is actually like a pretty good point. Booker is someone that, aside from this documentary, I really haven't heard mention of elsewhere. Like, he's not a big name in the civil rights movement, but rather he's a representative of these other everyday rank and file people throughout the South. It's part of why I like doing the Black History Shorts for this channel, where, sure, you have these big civil rights icons, and I think we should definitely celebrate them and talk about them. But I also like learning about these lesser-known individuals who stood up and tried to take a stand and make a difference in their own small way. It's actually a really good documentary, absolutely infuriating, but at the same time very inspirational hearing Booker's story, with the unfortunate thing being that he's not the only individual who met such a fate for simply standing up for the humanity of themselves and Black people. And so with that, I highly recommend the documentary. I think it's really great. It's insightful. At the same time, the subject matter is unfortunate. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist.